Thank you very much, Jabulani. It's a very good afternoon to everyone. This is a presentation which is part of a broad research that I'm carrying out in Western Zimbabwe. The research is mainly on the spotted hyena, land use changes, impacts on the spotted hyena, but I also felt that there are other issues which are actually affecting the species, and bushmeat was one of those. Hence, we thought of including that as part of the studies. Historically, we know that bushmeat has been harvested by communities, and it's been part of their life. It's been part of their normal societies, using traditional norms, generally for subsistence, for cultural purposes, and so forth, and also for food as protein as well as medicine. And as time went on, we saw, or we usually see, the introduction of conservation laws, which actually are trying to protect the animals within the conservation areas. However, we've seen that even in the presence of those conservation laws or legislation, there is an increase in poaching activities. And of late, we've seen an increase in commercial poaching, which is a cause for concern. But the situation is that there is very little understanding and change in various societies as far as understanding conservation issues are concerned. There's little transformation in embracing conservation laws, and also we find that poaching continues even if we try to introduce statutory instruments, we introduce acts that are actually trying to protect our wildlife resources. And when we look at the harvesting methods that are generally used by poachers, you would find that they are not really sustainable. At the end of the day, we have negative impacts that are actually happening in the ecosystem. But the other problem is that the communities are not willing really to accept the conservation laws that are actually being introduced to them. They feel that the laws are generally not fair, if I can use that term, and hence that causes continued arrests of community members as they poach wildlife in protected areas. And it also engenders a negative attitude, especially in areas where there are a lot of human-wildlife conflicts, because if they are arrested and yet spotted hyenas and lions sometimes prey on their livestock, then there is really a conflict in such a case. And we also have a scenario where bushmeat trade or consumption has associated risks. For example, we've got diseases. We also have loss of life in the process of setting their traps and so forth. Some actually lose their lives, and we have a problem. Then we also have disturbance, really, of the ecosystem in terms of the food webs and the removal of herbivores, which are food for our carnivores. So I also had a look on the methods that are generally used or have generally been used. We have got dogs, and in some cases, poachers use fire to drive animals to one area. They also use fire to divert conservation managers or rangers to that area while they are active in the other section of a protected area, and then they will be doing their illegal activities. Unfortunately, bushmeat trade and illegal hunting causes reductions in populations of various hunted species, especially the ungulates. But you would find that even non-target species are also affected in the process, because poachers sometimes use snares, and when they use these snares, they set hundreds of them, and snares are not selective. Hence, carnivores and herbivores are also caught in the process, and that threatens sustainability and causes instability within the ecosystems. And some of the snares are actually set in retaliation. Like I said, carnivores prey on livestock. So as they set all these 100 snares, some actually are targeting herbivores, but other snares are also targeting carnivores to reduce the problem that usually happens on the edges of protected areas. So now how can then we control illegal bushmeat harvesting in protected areas or near protected areas? The available knowledge that we have is generally not enough, particularly in Southern Africa, and the drivers of bushmeat hunting, of illegal activities, are generally not well understood. Hence, the attempts to manage the problem are actually quite difficult. And other confounding factors are lack of political will, very high economic instability. In this case, especially if we talk of Zimbabwe, there is really high economic instability, and that generally forces people to do other things which are actually illegal. Then poachers are also a syndicate. Sometimes you find that in communities, we may have poachers that are known, but they will never be reported by community members because they are also benefiting out of that particular activities. Hence, we undertook a survey to assess illegal bushmeat harvesting activities and community perceptions about such illegal activities on ongoing conservation efforts in Western Zimbabwe. Our prediction was based on a number of predictor variables. However, I'll just pick the ones that we felt are influencing bushmeat demand in Western Zimbabwe. One is the challenge generally in accessing the bushmeat, the hunter origins, whether the hunters or the poachers are local people or external people from that particular village. We also have season as one of the variables that we thought has an influence on the demand of bushmeat in an area, and also the methods that are used in accessing or hunting these animals. Then we had a second prediction that where we were looking at factors influencing perceptions on what people thought about bushmeat in relation to conservation efforts. And we had about 5 that we thought are likely to have an impact: distance of household from protected area boundary, the hunting zone, whether inside protected areas or outside protected areas, the target species, those that are usually targeted by poachers in those communities, the season as well, whether the dry season or the wet season has an influence, especially looking at how much will be harvested, and then what do people think about such things, and also employment status that is actually focusing on livelihoods. We think or we realize that this study is very important, especially when we look at bushmeat trade issues. It will shed some light on species decline in protected areas, large carnivore population management, which actually is a concern, precursor to further studies on bushmeat, and also would influence policy, especially looking at mitigation of illegal bushmeat harvesting activities in protected areas. And also it will shed some light, especially on the relationship between protected areas and communities. We did the study in Jambesi communal lens. You would find that this area is in the western tip of the country, close to Victoria Falls. Those who know Zimbabwe, Victoria Falls is somewhere there. Then you have your Zambia. Then we did the study here. These are communal people, which are actually, you'll find that there are many households in a small area. Then we have this part, which are recycled farmers. These are formerly wildlife farms. I think some of you might know the agrarian reform that took place in Zimbabwe, and these were wildlife farms, but people were recycled there to manage the wildlife and also stay there. So now we have livestock in these areas. We also have people, but in this case, we have got wildlife, we've got communal areas. And therefore, the management of the resources is different between these two areas, even if the people are actually in a communal setup. Then we structured our study by assessing these perceptions in 3 distance categories, where we had this part as, we considered it as inside wildlife zones because it is surrounded by protected areas. Then we have that part which is about 10 kilometers from the protected area, and then the other part which is more than 10 kilometers from the protected area. And then we tried to do some logistic regression, just checking whether bushmeat demand is high in the area, and also the attitudes of the people in that area. And what we found was that people confirmed that bushmeat demand was high. However, maybe I should mention that one challenge that you get when you are discussing bushmeat with people is that most of them are not willing to talk about it because it's sensitive. They might tell you some information and yet you are spying on them, then you report with the national parks and they get arrested. So some were not willing to disclose some information as we discussed. We then came up with some models with predictor variables which we thought are likely to influence demand of bushmeat. And I won't discuss the models, but I picked some variables that were actually important. And the first two that we have are bushmeat source, where the meat was actually coming from, and also the method that was used. Bushmeat source, some of the meat was actually coming from sport hunting carcasses, which actually are given to people. And you would find that some of the meat will be from poachers, and poachers take chances. When there is meat from sport hunting, they also sell theirs in the process, and you won't tell really whether the meat that they are selling is from sport hunting or it was poached. The hunting method also, as we can see, the use of snares, the gun, or combined method, but generally, subsistence poachers don't use the gun, but that is an indication that most of the meat that they were consuming, the bushmeat that they were consuming, was from sport hunting. Hence, they would say the gun was used to kill that animal of the meat which they are consuming. But generally, they would use snares. Then the other variables, predictors, sorry, the hunter origins, where the meat is coming from, or who is bringing in the meat within the village. And we found that external sources were actually common, but the difference with local sources was actually not that big. And hence, we considered that both local and external poachers were supplying the people with bushmeat in the study area. The season also had an effect where we are seeing a response, the probability that activities are high actually both in the dry and the wet season. However, when we look at the dry season and the wet season, we found that the dry season generally seems to have a more impact than the wet season. Then on the second prediction, where we asked them whether illegal bushmeat trade has an impact, whether they thought bushmeat trade has an impact on conservation, and that was their response. About 64% felt that bushmeat activities are not good for conservation. But there was a 36% which said, no, it's okay. We can always go ahead and hunt. There is no problem. And the variables of importance that we came up with were the hunting zone, whether they hunted inside or outside protected areas. That also seems to have an impact. And we looked at if we check that part where we see that hunting was actually both inside and outside protected areas. But you'd find that if you look at the communal setup, it's very difficult to hunt in communal areas, because if you use snares, livestock also graze actually in those areas. Hence, there were high chances that livestock will be caught, but that's what the model picked. Then we also had the distance, the perception on whether bushmeat activities have an impact on conservation. Those people within wildlife zones were actually a little bit positive, and those within 10 kilometers, because they were saying bushmeat trade is not okay if we check the blue, that part. Then in this case, we had a lot of people who were really not interested in sharing some information. Then we also had the hunting season as having an effect on perceptions about conservation and the employment status, which generally aligns with livelihoods in the area. And therefore, we found that bushmeat demand is really high in the area. And for your own information, you'll find that when we asked where they sell the bushmeat, in the community only or even outside, they also confirmed that the meat is actually sold even to truck drivers who are actually plying the route between South Africa and DRC. So they have a ready market locally and also for those who are actually in transit. And source and demand counter conservation effort, and the availability of bushmeat from sport hunting and problem animal control encourages concurrent selling by poachers. If we have a problem in a community, say it's an elephant that is giving people a problem, it will be shot. And then the meat is actually given to the people in the community. Hence, poachers also take chances to sell their wares or sell their meat in the process. Then we also have poachers targeting waterholes during the dry season. They actually get into protected areas and mount their snares near waterholes. Unfortunately, carnivores also target waterholes during the dry season because water will be scarce, and in the process, they are actually caught in those snares. Then, looking at the predictors that I talked about, we found that snares are generally common both inside and outside, but not very common outside. And the challenges in accessing bushmeat were actually that they don't have legal permits. Otherwise, if they were given the privilege to do so, many people were willing to venture into bushmeat activities. And that shows that the market is there and the people are willing, and hence our protected areas are actually at risk. And bushmeat scarcity inflates prices, leading to people actually viewing bushmeat as a lucrative business. Hence, they will venture into illegal activities. Hence, when we look at management of our wildlife resources, we find that it is very important for us to consider the livelihoods as a starting point. Probably, let me just move to this next slide. It is very important for us to consider livelihoods of the people. If we talk to them about conservation and we talk to them about preserving wildlife resources, and yet they are so poor, the community that I'm talking about is strongly rural, right? And the livelihoods are really something else, and there is therefore a need for us to consider alternative livelihoods in those areas as conservationists. Protected areas that are there and probably other private farms should work with communities in improving their livelihoods. Then we need also joint protected area community projects where people are actually linked with protected area managers. You'll find that in most areas, managers stay in the park. They don't go to the communities, and there is a problem there. There is need for flow of information. There is need for an interaction, and we are likely even to get more information in controlling those problems. Then there's need for policy realignment, remodeling the CBNRMs, the ECAs, and the communal areas that I talked about. You'll find that in those people who got into the farms, which were wildlife farms, actually manage their own wildlife. The revenue goes to them. But if you go out in the communal areas, you'd find that rural district councils are the ones that manage wildlife for the people on a 45-55% share. And there is a lot of misappropriation of funds. Hence, people are really not happy, and therefore, they are likely even to retaliate as far as conservation is concerned. We need to do more research on bushmeat issues, and generally there is need for, maybe just in conclusion, there is need for us to consider livelihoods, there is need for aggressive conservation education, there is need also for viable CBNRMs with tangible benefits, and also improved anti-poaching and agent, which is an agent necessity. Thank you very much.